You have the floor, Mr. Anderson.
May it please the court. So this is closing argument summation. And, last night I couldn't sleep very well, obviously, for all the reasons. And I was rolling around, and then I woke up, and it just came to me that we've been spending 9 weeks together. And you know what I know. And I know how I reacted to all the facts. And realizing that, suddenly I just had a great sense of comfort and confidence. And I went to sleep like a baby. Because I don't have to do that much convincing, nor would I try to do that much convincing. I'm going to try up here to make some connections for you, to try to help you back there, to give you some tools to work with. Now, I'm going to be up here the first time for about an hour and 15 minutes, out of which about 20 minutes, Mr. Whitney is going to come up and help with some of the verdict form math. That is not my forte, so we decided to split it up right there and give you the best we could do. And then a couple hours for these guys, and then I'll come up for a final 45 minutes and rebut whatever they're saying and make some closing arguments. So what we have here is a great American family, right? They're hardworking. They are devout. They are patriots. They have done everything a family should do. And none of what happened to them should have happened to them. It should not have happened to them. Your job is to figure out why it happened to them, how it happened to them, and what ends up being justice for them. In this case, for reasons that I still cannot fathom in many ways, Johns Hopkins doctors who are supposed to do no harm just blew up this family. It's beyond me. And I just have a difficult time understanding motivations. I understand more based on what we heard there at the last from Dr. Cochran about some of the whys of how it would happen. And Nick has reminded me, and I want to say this out of the box, for certain reasons legally, when I say none of this or all of this, this that I am talking about is what happened to Maya back with Miss Beatty. That is what I'm talking about, that period from October 7th through January 14th. That's what I'm saying when I'm saying this, none of this, or all of this. So the problem here is that by what pressures they put on Beata Kowalski, they took her out of the game. And she was, without a doubt, the quarterback of this team. Jack is an amazing man. But Beata was a force of nature. And Beata was capable of incredible amounts of work, tenderness, love, compassion. But she was also of an Eastern European background, and she could be brusque. But she was a lioness protecting her family. And we get into eventually what happened on that October 7th afternoon and evening. And I want you to think about one thing. If Johns Hopkins had not changed its diagnosis that quickly over that particular day, for reasons we'll get into, none of this would have happened. And that's medical malpractice. They did absolutely no research. They did not bring in experts. They did not have anybody who knew what they were doing examine Maya. And from the Kowalski standpoint, 6 days before, they had been back in with the same complaints, which is gastroparesis, which is from CRPS, right? And here they come in 6 days later, and it's completely changed. Now they're somehow treated like criminals. They're treated as though there's something wrong with them, even though, and consider it from their point of view, they've been coming to this hospital since literally before any of the CRPS symptoms started. They'd been going there for 15 months, and they'd never had a problem. They'd had support. And let me tell you, I don't think that everybody at Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital was bad, wrong, or evil. There were some good people over there. Some of their outpatient doctors were superb. But something was very wrong with this hospital. And as I was saying, I think Dr. Cochran got to the heart of it with the culture there. It seems to me that any time you put together an organization where no one can speak up, no one can comment on anything that's going to rock the boat, you're going to get this type of situation. You're going to get a situation where a Kathy Beatty can run wild and no one will catch her, no one will slow her down, no one will get her out of this and away from Maya. There simply was no accountability at this place, none. So, what you're trying to do now, and the way I was really thinking about it was, why don't I go through some of Johns Hopkins' defenses? Because I figured that if we got rid of the defenses, then all that would be left would be our case. And then it would be much easier for you to make up your minds about things. So if you look at some of their theories that we heard in the opening statement, one was that Maya had come in emaciated and they saved her because they put weight back on her. If you check out Dr. Wassenauer's weight, she was 27 kilograms 1 week before she went in there, and she was 27 kilograms when she was out 2 weeks later. So that theory's gone. That they had kept her off or gotten her off a bunch of drugs. You can look at the admission to see what meds she was on at the time. You can look at the discharge summary and see how similar it is. Nothing there. Nothing there. They argued that ketamine bad, ketamine scary. Ketamine worked. And they themselves, in their own routines and methodologies, they actually had a ketamine infusion process. So it wasn't the fact of infusing ketamine. What it was dosage. And they tried to scare everybody with the idea that these dosages were extraordinarily high. They worked, didn't they? They worked. And you know this because if you take a look at the progress through January through August of 2016 and the videos we showed you about how well Maya was coming along here, you can see how well they worked. Through all of this, keep in mind there was never a bad lab. Usually, if there's a drug that's going to really mess you up, if you are having some significant problems, one of the things you do is you look for the blood test for the liver primarily. What you're looking for here is to see if there's any substantial changes. Nowhere can they show you any continued or even, I don't think, any abnormal liver tests. That's an objective test that would tell you whether or not this was the wrong medicine or that there was too much medicine. They argued that Maya's recovery was all due to them. Well, no, it really wasn't. And she didn't really recover. She did much better. CRPS, as you know, is a disease that she's going to have the rest of her life. It's something that you manage. And so by taking her back so many steps, they made things so much worse for her. And it was only Maya's self-discipline and will. And I believe the idea in her head is that she wanted to prove to her mom that she could overcome, that she could do this. But it had nothing to do with Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital. And she was not cured. And she did not end up with no symptoms. On November 20th, she ended up with a terrible relapse. You'll see the photos of her with a feeding tube down her nose. And I mean, the one thing that struck out with me was that if you looked at her clavicle right here, she didn't even look like the same girl. That's how bad that relapse was. And then if you look at Dr. Henschke's records, you'll see that she had another one in 2022. It was simply, Maya had not recovered. Everything that she did herself. And in spite of Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital. So, what else have they tried to say? What are their other defenses? Well, they blame Beata for taking her own life. And although we'll get into a lot of this more, the fact is that Beata was reacting to a maternal instinct that she had almost no, and in fact, no ability to control. It was the same thing as a mother jumping out in front of a truck to push her 2-year-old out of the way, knowing that it would take her life. And when there's a competition between the maternal instinct and the self-preservation instinct, the maternal instinct is going to win each time. Now, let's start on a couple slides here to get rolling. The concept here is that none of Johns Hopkins' defenses that they put out in their opening or tried through the course of the case ever panned out. What they did in this case was pick around the edges and try to convince you that somehow you should doubt this poor girl, that somehow you should doubt Beata. And here she is with a relapse. Let's start at the beginning on the slides if we can. Friday, October 7th, 2016. Before this was an incredibly happy family and a good, strong marriage. And a mom who was overwhelmingly in support of her children. She was proud to be Polish. She was proud to share her heritage. And the focus of her love were her children. She loved Jack, but those children were the center of her life. Jack Kowalski is an amazing man. And one of the things that I really resented through all this is the idea that this man, who is a deputy fire chief, who ran into burning buildings, was somehow a Casper milk toast and wouldn't take any steps to control his wife. That is about the farthest thing from the truth. He's a quiet man. You saw him on the stand here. But in no way, shape, or form does he lack for bravery. Next one. And then 99 days later, I want to talk about the big overview of this. They go in, a happy family. Maya has CRPS, but Beata found a way. She worked her rear end off, locating the right physicians. Does anybody notice that all of the speculation about conversion disorder all came about before she was diagnosed by Dr. Kirkpatrick? If you look after that point and up until January 7th, nobody thought about that after the proper diagnosis was made. And all of the hospitals that considered, and never even diagnosed, but considered conversion disorder had one thing in common. They missed the CRPS diagnosis, right? So if you look after September 23rd of 2015, after Dr. Kirkpatrick made the appropriate diagnosis, you see that all tapered off because now they knew. Now it made sense. Beata finally got Maya to somebody who knew what they were talking about. She had solved the problem as best as the problem could be solved. CRPS is not something you can solve completely, but you know what? She found a way. She found a way to deal with it for her little girl. She found a way to get through this to the best of her ability and Maya's ability and give Maya the best life she possibly could. She went to doctor after doctor after doctor, searching. All of those that they want to blame on her somehow, that Beata was going to too many physicians, this was all before there was actually a diagnosis made. Of course she's going to do that. She's going to try to find an answer. And she found an answer. And I suggest to you that but for what Johns Hopkins did to this family, it would have been in control. And they would have gone on with their lives to the same successes, and they would have overcome this disease. And they could have gone on very, very happily with Beata there, and each of them able to live their lives as they wanted to. Afterwards, coming out, what do we know? Well, we know that mom's gone. Daughter is so weak she can barely keep herself upright in the car and needs pillows to be able to support herself. We know her CRPS is immeasurably worse. We know the family is in tatters. They have lost in many ways everything that made them up. They still have the love for each other, but they lost the driving force. Nothing was cured. Nothing was made better. Nothing was done to justify that time in there, except, of course, make Johns Hopkins a little more money, about $534,000 worth. Here, you see, she still had the dystonia. And you know what? I had 4 doctors come in talking about dystonia, about CRPS, and I could have called more, but I figured you'd had just about all that you needed to hear about CRPS, right? So I didn't call everybody that possibly treated her. I was on the clock a bit. What I did do was try to get through enough of them so you would understand exactly what was going on here and be able to identify it. And then I used video and audio and photographs to demonstrate all of the symptoms. I don't think there's any question but that Maya has and had CRPS, which then raises the question of why were these doctors on that day? Why did they shift from the diagnosis in all of their records up to that point of CRPS and go back to some psychosomatic thing? Why would you do that? Why go back to something that 4 or 5 different experts had, why would you abandon something 5 or 6 experts had confirmed and go back to something that you could only find pre-diagnosis and as speculation from a lot of other hospitals? Not even a lot, 2. And if we can continue on, let's go. So on October 1st, as I said, she comes in and she's got the same thing, abdominal pain worsening. The diagnosis is what I was saying, regional pain disorder, which is the same thing as CRPS, right? She has a milkshake. After ketamine treatment, she goes in, and here's what happens. She was only in for about 24 hours, right? And she came out, and they had dealt with it. The same thing would have happened on October 7th, but for whatever went on that afternoon and evening. She would have been in and out and continued on her way to recovery. Next one, please. So what happened on October 7th, 6 days after the last time she was in for exactly the same thing? And keep in mind, she had been into this place over 17 times before this. Don't you think if there was some sort of psychosomatic condition The over 50 doctors that saw her beforehand would have found that out. Couldn't they have figured that out? The Johns Hopkins doctors. She'd even been admitted twice before this. They were locked in to a confirmation of CRPS. So you've got Jack showing up. It wasn't Beata. It was Jack bringing her in. And she's in extreme pain, over and above the usual CRPS pain. Now, I don't know what went on here through all of this, but I have an idea. They find out from Dr. Hannah that she's getting ketamine booster treatments. Dr. Hannah lets them know, and they already basically knew. And in their records was Dr. Kirkpatrick diagnosing, an expert. Everybody knew. How did it change so much? Let me go again. I will come back in a moment to what I think really happened on that evening. But there was some confrontation. Something happened that changed everything and caused this hospital to come away with the idea that they had to prove that Maya did not have CRPS, she didn't have pain, and do everything they possibly could to try to convince her, a 10-year-old girl, 11-year-old girl, that she wasn't feeling what she was feeling, and to put the maximum amount of pressure on Beata. What would do this? So, leading up to this, one of the things they talk about are the amazing number of infusions. And I want to point out something else. I'm jumping around here a little bit. One of their big reasons for needing to keep Maya there was withdrawal, that somehow ketamine was like an opiate and you had to keep her there to wean her off or she would be physiologically harmed in some way, right? Take a look at the number of times that she had an infusion, which are in green, and all the red are the periods between those infusions. And if you look at the medical records, nothing in those records ever shows a single sign of any withdrawal. There's no shaking and there's no runny nose or jitters. There's no raised blood pressure for no apparent reason. There's nothing to indicate that this child's having withdrawal symptoms. The proof is in the pudding. I don't know why they brought the addictionologist in here, Dr. Levy, because she simply did not understand the disease, and her statements were so far afield, and she absolutely could not explain why Maya was able to get through all these, stop from anywhere from a day up to 37 days, and never have the single sign of withdrawal. And the reason was there are no withdrawals from ketamine. There aren't any. There was no reason to keep her there. There was no reason to keep her in the hospital. Maya should have been in and out, right? Right. So on this January 7th, Beata shows up to support her daughter. And you know what? I don't know what went on with Maya in terms of whether she was using bad language, and I don't care, because nowhere in this record before or after is there any sign whatsoever of her having done anything even remotely like that. And you've spent 8 weeks around her, and ask yourself, is she really the type to do that? Keep in mind also, though, she'd had a steroid course for a significant period of time before this. You ever heard roid rage? And there was no paneling when she went in to figure out what she was on. And then she was put back on a bunch of narcotics. But it doesn't really matter because they weren't looking at the history. Something happened back there between Beata Kowalski and that team, who I still can't figure out. I think it was Tepa Sanchez. I think that Dr. Malik was back there. some nurses, but something happened back there that ticked them off. They got...
I'm sorry? Are we approach?
Objections overruled. You may continue, Mr. Anderson.
All right. So back there, I'm not sure who said what, but I'm pretty sure with Beata's personality that what she did was start to question them and say, we were just here 6 days ago, and by the way, we've been coming here. You're supposed to be our hospital. You're supposed to be our doctors. Why are you putting us through this? Why are you questioning everything that I say here? I don't want Maya to have a blood pressure cuff because do you understand about allodynia? Do you understand about how this disease is? I've been coming here for forever. Why don't you people pick up on this? And that ticked them off because she was challenging them. And there must have been some words back and forth because somehow, somewhere, they decided to completely change over the diagnoses, and whether they did it immediately in the record or whether they simply did it in every way they approached everything and everybody that they told outside of the hospital. There's no question that they tried to change the narrative here. And walking in as a normal family with a child with a debilitating disease, they walked out suddenly with Beata as the enemy and Maya as a liar. That Maya was making all of this up and that Beata was somehow encouraging it. So whatever happened, and I'm pretty sure it was that Beata started to ask people's names. And she started to take down those names, and she started to ask very, very pointed questions. Because remember, within the first 24 hours they were there, they called risk management. Within 24 hours, with the patient they'd had for a year and a half, they called risk management. Something else very interesting here. Remember one of my first witnesses, Debbie Hanna? She was the social worker that was brought in. And it wasn't her regular gig, but she was brought in to help on this. And she sat down with the Kowalskis, and she said that they were like every other family with a child that was in a lot of pain and with a desperate disease. They were incredibly concerned. But she didn't see any signs whatsoever of abnormal behavior. And this is the social worker. This is the one that's supposed to pick up on stuff like this. And there's another thing I want you to keep in the back of your mind. She was never allowed and never did finish her psychosocial evaluation, which is what you put together to see whether there are any psychosocial problems. Are there any psychiatric issues going on here? Is there something going on that maybe we didn't spot over the past 15 months and 50 doctors? She was not allowed to complete that, and risk management took over. It's very strange, very strange. After that, what did we see? We saw Sally Smith brought in. What the heck was Sally Smith doing there? Why were they bringing her in? Why did they have her checking records on October 8th, the next day, without the Kowalskis' authority, by the way, and without their consent and without their knowledge? Why was she going in there and looking back at all these records? What was her role here? Sally Smith eventually comes in to see them, and she doesn't identify herself as Sally Smith. Whatever she's trying to say up there, you know she came in a lab coat, and she came in with her doctor's pass. You know she walked in, and she started to try to get information from them without identifying herself. She was trying to set up a case or some complaint or something. She was the hammer. She was the hammer that they might need down the road. Should the Kowalskis come back, make any complaints? Remember, this was a place where if a person complained, there was retribution. Dr. Corcoran? If a person complained, then there was a chance they could lose their job. Nobody was complaining up and down, and no one wanted to hear any complaints about them. And here was Beata taking down names. They panicked, and they decided they weren't going to let this brusque lady with an Eastern European accent coming in and telling them how to do their job and what they could do and not do and what tests they could do and not do, right? They got really, really upset at being bossed around by this lady. And she was a nurse too, which made it even worse. By the way, why are they so worked up about Beata Kowalski, an infusion nurse, giving her child infusions? I never made the connection there as to what that's supposed to signify to anyone. So after that, you can see here, well, beforehand, you can see the times leading up to it. After this, there's a psychological evaluation on January 6, 2017 by Dr. Duncan. You got that back there. There's no problem found. They bring in Dr. Lewis, who was working for the state. He was not one of their doctors. He was working for the state. You got to look beyond what you're being told to see what was really going on here. Dr. Lewis, whatever Maya's saying, he's putting down what he wants to say to try to support a narrative. But even he can't bring himself to say that this is psychosomatic. He says you got to get a pediatric neurologist to look at this to confirm whether or not there's a physiological basis, right? So Sally Smith is in here, and all of a sudden Sally Smith starts running the show. She was an apparent agent. Under the definition that you're going to get, I want you to check yes on apparent agent if you agree that we've proven through the testimony of Elena Kushner, who also, amazingly enough, had an Eastern European accent, and also had the same experience of Sally Smith coming in a white lab coat and starting to ask questions. No introduction. No, hi, I'm Dr. Smith. I'm here to help you. What can I do? Anything like that. No, probing questions to try to see what could be uncovered. The Kowalskis became the enemies. The Kowalskis had become the enemies, right? And remember, this was a hospital that was under immediate jeopardy of losing its license, right? These people were worked up, and they didn't want anybody rocking the boat. But in any event, they talk the Kowalskis into staying. They tell them, we're going to help here, we're going to help there. And Beata says, no, we're going to go back, like we did on the first, to Dr. Hannah, and we're going to complete the ketamine infusions because you guys can't help us. No doubt Beata brought her in to see if there could be an intubation and greater amounts of ketamine to try to get her out of this crisis. And when they couldn't do it, she concluded, why are we here? And tried to leave. And she was told, well, if you leave, then you're AMA, and we're going to call security. And that's in the records. So they were forced to stay. And as much as they try to dig around in the records, ask yourself, do you believe they really wanted to stay in that hospital when there was no reason to do so? Maya was not getting the care she wanted and the care that the parents wanted. You know, there's a lot of people watching this. There's a lot of people looking at this. There are CRPS patients. There are parents who have children in crisis trying to figure out what to do. There's a lot of people who are paying attention to what you're doing here.
Yeah.
And in this instance,
Sorry.
Objection is sustained.
Thank you.
and it's important here to consider what was going on behind the scenes. So, through the course of the time from October 7th up until the 13th, when this order was obtained, they desperately wanted to get out of that place, but were not allowed out of this place, although they tried to talk them into. Johns Hopkins did their best to try to convince the Kowalskis that, well, she's got withdrawal symptoms, she'll have withdrawal symptoms, we need to wean her down, everything you've been doing is wrong. And you know what? The Kowalskis were at least listening to them. They didn't buy it, but they were at least listening to them. They weren't uncooperative about this, but all they wanted to do was get out of there and get someplace where Maya could be properly treated. That's the reason they came in. They had no reason to stay there. They didn't want Maya under this hospital's care if the hospital couldn't do anything more for them. That's called false imprisonment. And that's where you would check yes on that particular one. I'm skipping around here, but in your verdict form, it's interesting. You've got different events listed, okay? And you're going to be asked individual questions about individual events. And so this is one of them. Another one is when when Kathy Beatty and company pinned her down on January 6th. That's another one. Right. He's right. I need to talk about the suicide. I'm interested here in the circumstances living up to Beata. You know, her motto was live with passion, right? And she had everything in the world to live with, live for. And she died with the same passion. Consider the fact that she came from a communist country and saw her father dragged out of the house by the powers that be, right? Beata Kowalski gave her life for her child because she knew Beata was prescient. She knew something was going on in that hospital, and she had been told repeatedly about how her daughter was suffering. And she knew enough to just listen to her daughter. And you heard the phone calls to know what was going on. And every time somebody saw her daughter, any of the neighbors that got in, any of the priest, anyone else who got in, she was pumping them for information. She knew exactly what was going on here. And so as Maya started to get worse and worse and worse, the anxiety of Beata went up and up and up until it came about finally that Beata determined, unless something drastic was done, there's a pretty good chance her daughter was going to die in this hospital. Why? She'd already seen a friend's daughter die from CRPS. CRPS can kill you. And in this instance, where you've got someone who is becoming so weak that they're laying down and they can't even hold themselves up, you're subject to blood clots that can go to the heart and kill. And that's what Beata was concerned about. There was retaliation against me because they knew I was going after the ICU. Filing charges with me with DCF automatically makes them automatically immune. But what it says here is that Beata knew what was going on with her daughter and knew she had to do something drastic. She knew they were retaliating against her. She knew that she was the key. If she was in the picture, Maya was never going to get out of there. And it was likely that Maya was going to end up in some kind of foster care and in some situation where she would be even worse.
Objection.
That's in the
Legal basis?
The legal basis is the immunity. We're not responsible for
I've already instructed the jury on that.
Okay.
She knew if she did not take herself out of the picture, that it was likely, it was a probability that her daughter would die. The best hope would be that her daughter lived, but was with some foster parents who did not understand the disease, or was placed in a situation where she was going to be in psychiatric care. And the rest of her life, Beata knew, because she was a nurse, that Maya would be followed through her entire life, dogged by these allegations that somehow there was a psychosis going on. Afterwards, Dr. Tepa Sanchez writes and says, she's talking to Dr. Laura Vos at this time, I learned today that Ketamine Girl's mom committed suicide yesterday. Sorry to say my prediction was correct. That means it had happened before. They knew about it, and yet they still kept the pressure on. They still kept the pressure on Beata. Oh my God. They still thought somehow this was the right thing to push Beata to the edge and over. They knew she was on the edge, and they kept up the pressure. There's no question but that this suicide was caused directly by their actions. On the verdict form, what you're going to see is a few things, but one of them is there's two bases. And you heard Dr. Richards testify about both of them. One is, was it a substantial factor? Were their actions a substantial factor in the suicide? I submit, absolutely. The second was, did she operate from an irresistible impulse? The irresistible impulse in this instance was the maternal instinct. There was nothing she could do about it. She knew if she didn't protect her daughter here, she was going to lose her daughter. And Beata knew also, she thought through the effect of her being out of the picture. She knew it'd be tough on Kyle. She knew it would be tough on Maya and Jack. But she figured having Maya alive was better than losing Maya. She knew they could get through somehow. But she could not stand the thought of losing her baby girl. Please take care of Maya. Don't make her suffer anymore. She doesn't deserve that. No child deserves that. Insofar as the verdict on suicide, I request that you check, yes, it was caused by them. And it's important, very important, that you answer questions 45, 46, 47, 48, and 55 in the positive, if you want a recovery for Jack and for Kyle. These are the causes of action for wrongful death, and they are allowed to recover based on being beneficiaries of the estate. So that if you want to award damages to Jack for the loss of his wife and to Kyle for the loss of his mother, then you have to determine that there was an intentional infliction of emotional distress. And under that definition, by any definition, this was emotional distress that was absolutely outrageous. You just don't do what they did to a little girl like this. You just don't take away a gift. You don't tell her that her mother's crazy. You don't tell her that her mother is in a mental institution. You don't pat her, and you know what? They were patting her. Beatty would come in and pat her on the way in and way out. She was trying to develop evidence so that she could say, oh, she never reacted to that. She must not have had allodynia. That's why she was doing it. You don't put a child on your lap. You do not cuddle with a child, and you sure don't kiss a child. There was no authorization whatsoever, and Maya loathed Kathy Beatty. Remember the attorney, Zimmerman, who said it came off in waves how much she disliked Kathy Beatty. Maya did not consent to anything, and what they did was continue to put the pressure on all the way through this. So let me talk a little bit about your verdict form. There's so much to talk about in these cases, it's easy to get bogged down on it. Under false imprisonment, your claim 1, I submit there's more than enough evidence to show that they were falsely imprisoned. Maya was falsely imprisoned on the occasion of October 7th through October 13th. And then you're asked to put down damages for her pain and suffering and for mental and psychological expenses and the reasonable value of hospitalization. And that question is repeated several times through this on each one of the first few 2 claims. What I suggest you do in trying to determine exactly how much to award is that you make a determination of the gross amount of pain and suffering, loss of capacity to enjoy life, mental anguish, and you determine the big picture, because you're going to have to determine that for intentional infliction of emotional distress and malpractice, okay? And then you go back and you assign a percentage of that to each one of these events, because each one of the events are set out separately, and you're supposed to award damages separately. Now you have in your records there, you've got the $10 million plus for Dr. Bifolco's plan, for his life care plan. And that then is spread out among the first 2 based on the percentages that you see are the most severe. If you determine, for instance, that the January 6, 2017 incident, where she was stripped, pinned down, photographed against her will, if you determine that that one is one of the most severe, you would put the highest percentage for it. So do the math first. Figure out, and Nick's going to give you some ideas about this. Figure out using and we've got the formula in there. Figure out the number of days that she was down. Remember how we had them fill out all of these forms to tell you how many days per week that this was really affecting them? And then you need to talk among yourselves and figure out an hourly rate. Now, we use hourly rates for a lot of different things in our lives. And this is the best way we have come up with for you to measure what happened to them. So you would take the hourly rate that you determine, and Nick's going to go over the remainder of it, but you're going to multiply it out against the amount of years left, which will give you the amount of days. I'll let him talk about it. But then what we want you to do is come back and give a percentage as to each one of the events. And that way you'll be able to capture all of them. And there's an instruction there about don't duplicate. This is a good way of making sure that that does not happen. Is if you use it by percentages after determining the entire amount of pain and suffering, loss of capacity to enjoy life, mental anguish. So you have a series of questions in your first few pages about false imprisonment, and you'll be asked about how to give the numbers for each one of those. Then you've got battery, and it is the battery for the whether they committed battery on Maya Kowalski on January 6th. I think everyone here agrees from the testimony that Maya was battered. And then, like I said, you have separate questions there, right, for the damages. Then it's the second one on claim 2, battery, hugs, kiss, and pats. In this instance, we're talking about the instances where Kathy Beatty is hugging her, patting her, kissing her, putting her on the lap, but it's broader than that. You just can't be duplicative. That's why I say come up with the percentage after you determine the total. And then there are claims for the total. And it's important that you emphasize the damages for these 2 to begin with, because they are what we call core events. They are the batteries and the false imprisonments and the things done to them, out of which many of the other causes of action, particularly intentional infliction of emotional distress, which is your big picture one, will be based. So if you're going to award damages, economic damages, they need to be heavily weighted towards the first two causes of action, battery and false imprisonment. Then you get to medical malpractice. In this instance, you heard testimony from Dr. Chopra. You heard testimony from Dr. Eli Neuberger that they deviated from the accepted standard of care. And you'll be asked then, again, to divide out damages for that medical malpractice. But again, that's a much bigger picture. On moving to and you have to, by the way, on medical malpractice, you have to go through the conduct of Sally Smith. And for Sally Smith, here's what you need to consider. Sally Smith shouldn't have even been there, but she was an apparent agent. An apparent agent is someone who presents themselves as though they are part of the hospital. You know she did, and there's backup testimony to that. But she's in there, and they're responsible for her. But Sally Smith was telling them to take her all the way off medication, telling them to put her in the room for 48 hours. Those doctors are also responsible because they should have rejected that. They should have said, what are we doing here? By the way, one of the defenses they're going to talk about is, oh, this is all medically authorized because they signed a medical authorization at the start. That's if it was medical. This was not medical, and you haven't heard any evidence of any discussions that it was medical. If you look at the records before and after these dates, the October 18th, 19th, 48 hours, look before and after that. No medical discussion whatsoever. This wasn't for medicine. This was for the purposes of developing evidence against them. If you look again in the January 6th, the Kathy Beatty incident with the photographs, the idea was, well, they're authorized to take the photographs only if it was for a medical reason. This wasn't a medical reason. They did not discuss it before or afterwards. This was not for the reason of trying to diagnose or treat Maya. This was to help them for their other goal in this case, was to frankly take things out on the Kowalskis. On fraudulent billing, claim 4. This has to do with the amount of money that was billed for CRPS when they denied in everything else that she had CRPS. Now they're going to try to mix that in here. Don't let them. The CRPS, in every way outside of that billing, they did not treat it as CRPS. And they represented to the outside world that it was not CRPS. And if you go to the discharge summary, you'll see CRPS is not listed. So what they did is they billed for a bunch of stuff that they actually did not do. They weren't treating her for CRPS. They weren't doing the things you need to do. Keep in mind that Katzenstein, Dr. Katzenstein, only gave her 5 hours of therapy through the course of 97 days. Got it. And so checking yes to that, and then as to the damages on this, for various reasons, these are going to be what are known as nominal damages and taken care of later. So these are going to be, if you review the facts and you see the evidence involving any increase in insurance or any copays, you can put that down. If you cannot find specifics on that, you may put $1 as a nominal damage, and that'll be taken care of later. Then we get to count 5, survivor claim for intentional infliction of emotional distress for the estate of Beata Kowalski. This is the manner in which you can compensate Beata and the rest of her family for her loss. If you check yes, then they can be. If you check no, they cannot be. And then you determine, as the best you can, her pain and suffering, mental anguish, and extreme caused by the extreme emotional distress prior to her death. Nick will talk a little bit about this. Claim 6, on the estate. Again, they're going to go through whether or not this was an uncontrollable impulse to die by suicide. We suggest you check yes. And whether it was a substantial factor, it was too, and that you check yes. And of course, the top 136, did Johns Hopkins Hospital, through the acts of the employees, engage in extreme and outrageous conduct? Yes. And then you get into the damages. Now, you've seen the report. The net accumulations are the amount of money that Beata would have made and they would have had for the family, deducting from that their living expenses, which Christy Kirby has already done for you, and it's in her report. And then it's the damages of the surviving spouse, Jack Kowalski. And here, again, we suggest that you use our method for how to compute damages, which is to figure out for hour by hour what the value is for him to have lost his wife. Everything that goes into that. The consortium, the comfort, the support, the waking up at 4 a.m. and having somebody next to you and then not having somebody next to you. All of those goes into your determination of how to compensate Jack Kowalski. And so what you would do there, and I'm suggesting $100, but there is evidence in the record for this, anywhere from minimum wage, which is like $12, up to, there's evidence in the record of $700 per hour. We put 100 in just to give you an idea, but you can go twice that, 3 times that. Whatever you determine as jurors is the best way to express the loss here to these folks. And so you go through the amount there, and then you get to go finally to the survival damages of Kyle Kowalski. We haven't talked about Kyle a lot here, but he lost his mother, and he's not going to have his mother there for many of the events in his life. She's not going to be there if he gets married. She's not going to be there to send him off to college. She's not going to be there to comfort and support him as he gets out in the real world. There really is no way to adequately compensate him. And the only thing we can do here is dollars. That's the way we do it in the United States, because it's the only way we can show. And remember, this is not a reward. You're not rewarding these people. It's a award, trying to measure their loss. You're trying to express the loss. And then the intentional infliction of emotional distress of Maya Kowalski. All right. Maya lost her mother. I don't even know how to begin to describe that. Maya will be affected the rest of her life. You have life tables that will tell you how long Beata would have lived and been in her life. She will not be there to help Maya pick out her bridal gown if she ever decides that she wants to get married. She will not be there when the stresses and strains of life are there. She will not be there at the other end of the line to pick up the phone and talk to. She is not going to be there when Maya needs her most. And for that, you have to find out. You have to look at the evidence and use your own life experiences to determine what that value is. And again, I suggest you look at it by the hour, and then you go back and you multiply that by the number of hours per day and the number of days per year against the total life of Beata Kowalski. That means the amount of time in Maya's life. Then you sign and date the verdict form. There is so much to talk about in this case. I haven't spent as much time on liability as I'd like to, let alone about Kathy Beatty. Beatty had mental problems. There was something very wrong with her. And when you say, as she said in one of those statements there, when she was brought up for her behavior, you want to take this outside. What does that mean? That means she's trying to pick a fist fight with the other employee. That was on November 20th, 22nd of 2016. Was it really logical and reasonable to have somebody with that type of personality assigned to Maya? And why did Maya need somebody assigned to her to begin with? Why did you have somebody follow her around all the time, floor to floor? What was going on there? They had a plan. And the plan was to force Maya to agree with them that she really didn't have pain, and force Beata to take some action that would make her even more vulnerable. We don't know how. Now we know how she acted out. But they were hoping for some outrageous action out of Beata that would give them even more power over the situation. I submit to you that Beatty wanted Maya for her own.
Mr. Anderson, you have consumed 1 hour.
I'll come back and talk to you a little more. I'm going to let Nick talk for just a second on some numbers. And then the other side gets a chance to talk, and I'll be back to talk to you. What's that?
So last time I had to do this, he gave me a whiteboard and I sat right there and had to scribble it out. And this time he gave me about 12 hours notice. So it's time to do some math. And now he's left me 10 minutes to do it with you. So here we go. I'm here to give you, it's a difficult task to decide what justice is here for the Kowalski family. So I'm here to give you some formulas using that $100 an hour figure, based on the testimony of Maya and Kyle and Jack. And I'm going to put some big numbers in front of you. That's what justice requires here. So we'll start. First, I want to take a look at the verdict form, claim 2, battery, which is page 8. And I'm looking at question 18. Now, January 6, 2017, you have conclusive, uncontested evidence in the record that on that date, there was a battery of Maya, and over her objection and tears, Catherine Beatty admitted that unfortunately they went ahead and did it at the direction of risk management. And question 18 is where you award damages for each of these categories. That's why I'm focusing on each of these, you make separate calculations. Pain and suffering is its own. Mental anguish is its own. Loss of capacity for the enjoyment of life is its own category. And each of them are going to be calculated for the past and future. And I recognize some of you probably have mathematical skills better than the others. So I'd ask you to lean on those folks as you're back there with a calculator trying to figure this out and do what you need to do to deliver justice. So let's go through some examples of how you would calculate for each of these categories. If you'd pull up slide 57 to begin. Well, this bucket of different categories I've just described here and pointed out to you, we've called them human damages. And so we're going to talk through not all of them because you have to do this for each claim. There are 2 separate battery claims. There are 3 separate false imprisonment claims. There's intentional infliction of emotional stress for Maya. There's medical malpractice. For each of these, you have to do this calculation. And then as Mr. Anderson was saying, once you come up with your total figure, then you decide, this PTSD and what Maya's suffering with, 50% of this was due to, and it really focused on this battery on January 6th. I don't know. That's your job. That's your job to allocate once you have this final number. If we go to slide 59, please. I'm going to show you the first calculation here. All right. Maya Kowalski testified that she experiences and has experienced mental anguish 15 hours a day on average if you take a good week and a bad week. Since this horrific saga ended at Johns Hopkins Children's Hospital, it's been 6.82 years. You can check our math on that. That's to the day since she was discharged. And if you apply the rate of $100 an hour to her past mental anguish, you get to this figure of $3.7 million. That's the past figure. That's the past mental anguish. Mental anguish is one of the categories under battery for the question 18. Now we have to do the same thing for the future. And you'll have the life care tables back there with you. They're at the mortality tables. Exhibit 2060, there's page 002, and there's pages 47 to 50. So you can check that our economist, when she came in here, and what we're representing to you is Maya's life expectancy from those mortality tables. So we do the same math. We take the hours per day that Maya experiences mental anguish. We take the days per year. We take the years remaining in Maya's life, and we multiply that by $100. And you get a figure of $34.8 million for Maya's mental anguish. And if you go advance one more here, you'll get a total for her past and future mental anguish. Then you allocate that among the different claims. If you'll back up to slide 55, please. We have, in addition to the human damages, we have economic damages. And these are directly from the testimony of Christy Kirby, the economist, and the life care plan. This is when I was writing on the whiteboard over here. If you go to slide 56, this is the essence of what Christy Kirby told you. At a wage or an annual earnings of approximately $100,000, which we would submit to you underestimates Maya's potential before this all happened to her. The loss of earning capacity is $5 million. And then you have future medical expenses, and this was based on the testimony of Dr. Bafolko, and then Christy Kirby coming in and giving you the present value calculation. $10 million. So now you have economic damages to Maya Kowalski of $15 million. And you'll see this ability to compensate Maya Kowalski for her future medical needs and her future loss of earning capacity in several different places. For example, you'll see the ability to compensate her for future medical expenses in question 17 on the verdict form. Then I need to go to the verdict form for just a moment to look at question 34 and 36. And Mr. Anderson discussed this for a moment, but to unlock your ability to compensate and deliver justice, not just to Maya, but to Beata and Jack and Kyle, you need to answer yes on question 34. That Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital, through its extreme and outrageous conduct, inflicted severe emotional distress on Beata, even before her death. You need to answer yes to that question, and then you'll advance to question 36 on the next page. And question 36, you need to answer yes. And if you answer questions 34 and 36 yes, then you have the opportunity to do justice for Jack and Kyle and Beata. If you answer no to those questions, 34 and 36, you'll only be compensating Maya. Having checked yes on questions 34 and 36, now we have to discuss what the wrongful death damages. So if we go to slide 63, please. We're going to talk first about Beata's loss, what's called loss of net accumulations. And this is just legal jargon for if Beata had survived this onslaught, how much would she have earned through her wages as of the time of her death in 2016, adjusted for inflation, adjusted back for present value. This is the number Christy Kirby gave you, $653,000. Then we go to Jack's wrongful death damages, slide 64. There are two categories here, and I'm going to direct you to the jury questions, which are at 40 and 41. If we could put those up for just a moment. Sorry to switch back and forth on you here. All right, right there. Questions 40 and 41. The damages for Jack Kowalski for the loss of Beata. He has two primary categories. The first is the loss of her support and services. This was, again, a number that Christy Kirby calculated for you based on something like a wage of $20 an hour for her helping to get the kids to figure skating or taking them fishing or doing laundry or cooking, those types of things. And that number I'll show you in a moment. I also want to show you that under 41, you get to compensate Jack Kowalski for the loss of Beata's companionship, what Mr. Anderson was just referencing about not being able to wake up next to his wife. So if we go back to slide 65. All right. As I mentioned, Christy Kirby did the math. I said $20 an hour is $20.10 in the past, $24.87 in the future. Total services lost by Mr. Kowalski due to Beata essentially being a good spouse and helping him around the house, $801,000. That's fairly simple. Next slide, loss of Beata's companionship. Now we get into calculations that are similar to what we did with Maya for her human damages. Jack has shorter life expectancy. We're using the same $100 figure. So the numbers are a little bit lower for Jack because, fortunately, he doesn't have as long to live. So if we show here the past calculation, he testified again to 14 hours a day. We get $3.4 million for losing Beata's companionship. And then if we go to the future, again, this is based on the mortality table. You advance. 19.4 years remaining in his life expectancy. And we get a figure of $9 million for his future loss of Beata's companionship for a total of $13,398,000. Again, the $100 figure is up to you. The hours per day is up to you. You judge the credibility of the Kowalski family, and you go back and you look at your notes as to what they testified to hours per day, and you arrive at the appropriate number. You have to do the same thing. I'm not going to show you another calculation, but in question 41, loss of his wife's companionship is one category. Pain and suffering is a separate category. So you would do a similar calculation for Jack's pain and suffering. Let's advance to slide 68. Having done those calculations at $100 an hour, this is the figure we suggest to you for Jack's wrongful death damages, $26 million. Now I'm going to show you how to do similar calculations for Kyle under the wrongful death claims, which would mirror what you would do for Maya. So if we go to slide 73, and then 74. Now, each of Maya and Kyle have, it's not the loss of just companionship, it's the loss of parental companionship, guidance, and instruction. It's not having their mom around to bake with or take them to figure skating or help them with their homework, teach them piano. This is what Kyle testified to. Kyle's a little more stoic, quiet. He testified to 8 hours per day. So we do the same calculation for the past in much the same manner we did it for Maya Kowalski. And for loss of parental companionship, we get to $2 million in the past, and in the future, over his life expectancy, not having a mom and thinking about those 3 months for the rest of his life, and that day that he saw his mom in the garage. $17 million. And then total for Kyle Kowalski, and this is your only opportunity to compensate Kyle Kowalski in this lawsuit, $19 million. So, and then we could advance to slide 77. I'm sorry, 76, please, if you could. Is this 76? All right. Having performed those calculations for the two categories available to Kyle in this lawsuit, we submit $36 million is a starting point at $100 an hour. Next slide, please. And then we would total up the wrongful death damages. And you know what? I'm going to skip these. Go to slide 78, please. Having used this construct, used this math, used the $100 an hour we suggested, and checking yes on the appropriate questions, you would arrive at a figure of $238 million. We're not here to tell you that's the number you need to put up. We're here to tell you that that's at $100 an hour. There's a movie called Onward. The basic plot is it's an animated Pixar film. I have kids 10 and 7 myself, so I watch more of these films than I hope to. Two boys lost their father, and they spend the movie attempting to bring back their father for a moment through magic and spells and a treasure hunt, and at the end they're successful. The $100 an hour figure we submit to you, if any of these three had an opportunity to pay $100 for an hour with their mom or their wife, they would do it. They'd pay $1,000 an hour. We don't think $100 an hour is appropriate. We ask you to deliver justice for the Kowalskis.
Are the plaintiffs at this point concluding their first part of their closing argument? Mr. Anderson, Mr. Whitney?
Sir.
Are you concluding your first part of your closing arguments?
I think we're out of time.